The Honourable Member for Vermilion-Lloydminster.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, it's my pleasure to move an amendment on Bill 35. I'll wait for the pages to distribute same and provide you with the original copy of the amendment before reading it into the record. Madam Chair, I will say as a preface that this amendment attempts to address what has appeared at least to be a very arbitrary setting of the spending limit for constituency associations, or at least at the constituency association level. You will recall when I spoke to this on second reading that there is a certain amount of inconsistency in the setting of the maximum allowable spending from the time it was discussed at committee to what the committee eventually landed on to what has now ended up coming back in the form of the bill. And this is, I think, demonstrates that the government and the minister have not really landed on a number, and the number that they have landed on is completely and totally arbitrary. And certainly something as important as this should not be left just to an arbitrary pick a number out of the air, throw darts at a dartboard methodology for determining spending limits. And so, Madam Chair, I move that Bill 35, the Fair Elections Financing Act, be amended in Section 36 as follows. A, by striking out the proposed Section 41 sub 3 sub 1 and substituting the following. Election expense limits dash registered candidates. 41 sub 3 sub 1, no registered candidate and no chief financial officer of a registered candidate shall incur election expenses in respect of an election in an electoral division that exceed in the aggregate the greater of A, $50,000 as adjusted in accordance with Section 41.5, or B, 50% of the amount established pursuant to Section 31 sub 1 sub A of the Legislative Assembly Act for the establishment and maintenance of a constituency office by a member for that electoral division. B, in the proposed Section 41 sub 5 sub 2 by striking out 41.3 and substituting 41 sub 3 sub 1 sub A. And C, in the proposed Section 41 sub 5 sub 3 by striking out 41 sub 3 and substituting 41 sub 3 sub 1 sub A. Madam Chair, what this amendment endeavors to do is it endeavors to bring some rhyme or reason to the spending limit for a candidate in a specific election. And, you know, we looked at this, and at committee the initial recommendation was to have a $40,000 limit for candidates, except to have it $50,000 for certain northern constituencies. And the rationale for having a higher limit for northern constituencies was to cover travel expenses, which most people that are representing northern constituencies were quick to point out that that is not necessarily a major contributor to the expense of running a campaign. But nonetheless, that $10,000 differential was felt somehow to be a rational thing to do. And then when it was stated that 40 and 50,000 seemed rather low, again, as this committee often did, there was an adjournment of debate, which happened a number of times, and then later on, a new proposal was brought forward where the limits should be 70 and 80,000, again with the $10,000 differential for northern constituencies. Again, with no strong rationale for why that differential should be in place. Nonetheless, the committee eventually landed on that figure, $70,000 and $80,000. And, you know, when you look at what most of the candidates that ran in the last election actually spent on their campaigns, that was a limitation that was one that most candidates should be able to comfortably stay under. Now, there were some candidates who spent more than that. For the most part, interestingly, those candidates were not successful in winning the election, which lends even more credence to the argument that big money didn't decide, certainly the last election. But that was the limit that was decided upon and was voted upon by the committee. And then somewhat inexplicably, when the bill comes to the House, we now are back to a $50,000 limit with some exemptions, and certain exemptions on travel expenses and for certain other, certainly very reasonable sorts of expenses for that can be incurred during the course of an election campaign. I was personally somewhat disappointed to see that kennel fees were excluded from that list, but nonetheless. Mr. Chair, I do look, though, at that number and consider it to be entirely arbitrary. There's no rhyme or reason to it. 40,000, 70,000, 50,000, how do we come up with those numbers? And I got to thinking to myself, you know, it's interesting. The gentleman that occupied the chair you're sitting in right now for over 3 decades, Dr. McNeil, recently retired, was perhaps known as the Dean of Clerks of the entire, certainly of all the legislatures in Canada and maybe perhaps even in the British Commonwealth. And one of the things that we are all as members familiar with is that Dr. McNeil developed the formula for the Member Services Allowance, the MSA. And that formula takes into account a number of factors, including the number of electors, the population, the size of the constituency, and the distance of the constituency from the city of Edmonton. And that using a formula that Dr. McNeil, an engineer, developed, that was how they arrived at the MSA. And you know, it's interesting because I think most of the members in the legislature will agree that the MSA is eminently fair in terms of taking all of those factors into account in determining what amount should be allocated to the budget to run our various constituency offices. And so I thought to myself, well, we have this model already. We have a model that is workable, that is generally agreed upon by most members as being fair and equitable, and that takes into account the fact that 87 different constituencies are in fact very different. And to apply a one-size-fits-all $50,000 limit to all 87 constituencies, some which may have a population in the 50, 60,000 range, and others which have a population that is barely 15 or 20,000, some which cover an area that is massive and cannot even be reasonably driven across in one day with a vehicle, whereas others are small enough that they could be comfortably walked across. We have a considerable diversity of constituencies, size, shape, population, you know, in terms of the population, the ethnic mix in the population, the backgrounds, whether it's rural, whether it's urban. You know, the point of it is that these constituencies are not all the same. And so why should the spending limit be the same for all constituents? It just simply doesn't make sense. So to have something that is in fact a rational way of determining a constituency spending limit, we already have the formula in place. And it is a formula that was worked out by Dr. McNeil, and I think it is a formula that has some rhyme or reason to it. It takes into account some of the different factors that are involved. And so rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, my suggestion is that we simply take that formula and that we take 1/2 of the amount that is designated by the MSA, and that be the spending limit for that constituency, except in cases where 1/2 of the MSA would be less than $50,000, and that's the reason why it says in the amendment the greater of 50,000 or 1/2 of the MSA. I think that this provides an acknowledgement, at least, that not all constituencies are the same, that different constituencies will require different types of campaigns, and that some constituencies, by virtue of their geography or by virtue of their population mix, where you'll have to campaign in a different way. And I think that this particular amendment allows for that. It provides for that. I think it is a rational and reasonable amendment, and it also provides for the fact that it's not just an arbitrary number. It is a number that will be very clear because it's set annually by the Legislative Assembly office, and so candidates will know exactly what their spending limit is, either $50,000 or some number greater than $50,000, and that will allow them to spend an amount that is comparable to the needs of their constituency. And so, Mr. Chair, I would encourage my colleagues in the legislature to seriously consider this amendment. I think it provides for a level of flexibility within the spending limit, and that spending limit then has some relationship to the complexities and to the diversity of constituencies within the province of Alberta. Thank you.